The White House released its highly anticipated new national security strategy, from prioritizing the Western Hemisphere to emphasizing deterrence over Taiwan and a warning to Europe. The strategy is encouraging some while disquieting others. Joining us to unpack it all is Dr. Keith Naughton, co-founder and principal at Silent Majority Strategies. Keith, thank you so much for joining us. Now, some are calling this national security strategy a radical departure, including from the one during Trump's first term. How are you reading this document? What changes stand out to you the most?
Well, I think it's a long overdue rewriting of America's formal strategy. Our main interests are in the Western Hemisphere, and we do have significant interests in Asia. China and the CCP are the most significant threat to American economic security. So I think that is the correct pivot to do. I think one of the reasons for the aggressive attitude towards Europe is that the United States has been very soft on Europe for 50 years. They've been really freeloading off of American defense. They haven't had to make any difficult decisions. They've engaged in appeasement towards China, Russia, and Iran. And when you do that long enough, eventually reach a breaking point. And I think the Europeans should treat this as a wake-up call to unite and be much stronger in defense of their own interests and to be better allies. They haven't been good allies for the last 20 years.
And digging in here, this time China doesn't top the list. Instead, the report lays out the Western Hemisphere, as you mentioned. Previously, it did that as well in 1987, 1990, and 2006. Expanding on your earlier point, what do you make of this emphasis on the Western Hemisphere this time?
Well, I think it's intelligent because it feeds into domestic politics. And in the end, American presidents are going to be judged on what happens in this country much more than what happens in other nations. And there's significant problems in the Western Hemisphere. We've got a lot of drug trafficking, an enormous amount of this illegal activity, a lot of smuggling. These transnational gangs are often abetted by government officials, like in Venezuela and local officials in Mexico. That's causing direct harm to this country. It's causing thousands of drug deaths, tens of thousands of drug deaths every year. That's something that should be addressed very robustly and very aggressively. I think that the president is also engaged in negotiation with China over trade. So I think it's smart right now to not raise up the rhetoric when we're talking about China right now. If he can get through these negotiations, then I think that would be a positive thing.
When it comes to China, the report says President Trump single-handedly reversed more than 3 decades of mistaken American assumptions about China, namely that by opening our markets to China, we would facilitate China's entry into the so-called rules-based international order. This did not happen. China got rich and powerful and used its wealth and power to its considerable advantage. As for solutions, the document calls for American dominance in key technologies and defense equipment, a strong capital market, and coordination with allies with similar values. How are you reading this? What does this mean for U.S.-China relations going forward?
Well, I don't think it would have gone back 30 years, maybe 20 years. I think that the permanent normal trade relations were an enormous mistake. A country the size of China with its population was never going to simply live by Western rules. It's a society and a civilization that's been around for millennia, depending on who does the accounting. But it's got a proud culture. So this idea in the West that everyone in China was just going to be like the West, that was always a fantasy. That was very arrogant. It was going to develop on its own terms. Unfortunately, the country's overlaid by the CCP, which has corrupted the nation and has been very aggressive. So it's a bit of a toxic mix. So we should have been much more cautious for the past 20, 25 years. And I think it is a long overdue correction. And it was Trump who made the correction in his first term. And Biden didn't move off of that. He continued the tariffs against China, continued a more aggressive posture, not enough, but at least somewhat. So I think that's the correct move. But it would be beneficial to build at least some type of relationship that maintains sort of a peaceful coexistence, because, a shooting war, a hot war over Taiwan, over trade would be very damaging to both countries. But as part of that process, the United States needs to become more independent economically and on technology.
I want to get to Taiwan, but digging into one of your earlier points, some are pointing out the softer language, if you will, on China, for instance, not calling out the regime's authoritarianism. Now, Politico reported before the strategy came out that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was pushing for more done on the language when it comes to China, citing the sensitivity over ongoing trade negotiations with Beijing. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a departure from previous reports when it comes to China or the language around it?
I'm not too upset about softening language. I mean, we spend too much time on parsing words and language and trying to satisfy different interest groups with the right kind of phrasing. What matters is really action and policy. So as long as the administration is pursuing action and policy that promotes economic independence, that allows Taiwan to defend itself and is very robust in that defense of Taiwan, I'm not too concerned about the language. We know that China has a problem. It is overly authoritarian. It has abused its minorities. It has corrupted its own very proud culture. But there's really not that much we can do about that. That's best left to NGOs and private citizens and so forth. The fact is the United States has certain interests it has to deal with China on, and going down this path about trying to dictate their internal policy is very difficult for the government to do. It should be left to independent journalists and NGOs.
And militarily, the document calls for ongoing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific to prevent war, highlighting the U.S. and allies' capacity to deter any attempt to seize Taiwan. Given that, how do you see Beijing responding to this document?
Well, it's very curious. You know, their public response under Xi Jinping has been sort of very prickly. Anytime there's the slightest whiff of criticism, they really go on the attack. I mean, the Global Times, I'm not sure there are people actually writing it. I think they just have some sort of computer program that just attacks anyone who criticizes China. I think that the reality is if we give enough defense to Taiwan, if we provide enough weaponry, if we have a strong defense posture with South Korea and Japan and Australia, that will result in China pushing, moving back or being reticent to be aggressive. I would like to see the administration be more firm with the Philippines, because right now China is engaged in some horribly abusive actions against the Philippines and some of the sovereign Philippine territory in the Scarborough Shoals. So I think the administration should be more aggressive on that side. But I think it's good that they reaffirm the defense of Taiwan.
And Keith, lastly, as for Europe, the strategy lays out what it calls Europe's civilizational erasure due to loss of national identities from immigration and cratering birth rates, saying this is resulting in military and economic stagnation in Europe. How big of a change is this regarding Europe?
Well, I think there's some conservative critics that got in the room and decided to insert some of their philosophy into the document. I agree with those opinions. That is a significant problem for Europe. What I would have preferred is something more critical about their lack of unity and their lack of resoluteness in their own defense. I'll give you a quick example. The Europeans froze $300 billion of Russian assets on an attack that they considered an existential threat to the continent. They've been accused credibly of sabotage around Europe, sending drones onto airfields, espionage, et cetera, et cetera. And just recently, they couldn't agree to cash in that money to pay for the damage that the Russians have caused. And they continue to buy their energy, by the way. That's crazy. They're worried about the legal ramifications. I mean, this is not a continent that's serious about its own defense. That's what I would have focused on if I was writing this document. I think that's been a point that's been made elsewhere. But Europe has very little room to criticize the United States when it comes to defense. They have created their own insecurity, and they need to be serious about addressing it.
Dr. Keith Naughton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.